Chief, we got a lot of things to talk about. How about yourself? Everything going well on the course? Anything in particular that's becoming challenging?
Yes. Everything's fine, yeah. Your instructions and explanations, et cetera, have been spot on, so greatly appreciate it.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. Hey, Dwight, how you doing?
Good, fine.
Good. So I guess I'll start maybe just by asking you too, Dwight, if there's anything in particular I can go over, and if not, there's just a few things I wanted to touch on this week.
Well, I guess my question is on the one thing, the 10.2, the New York State of Mind.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward. But what I find interesting, at least I do, is that there's a certain amount of variety of what you want to do with the chords. I don't assume there's a right or wrong answer necessarily, or am I incorrect about that? For example, are they supposed to always sort of resolve themselves? Because some of them sort of do, but it gets into I guess my idea of the definition of what is your definition of resolve?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean, there's a certain amount of freedom of what you want to do. I realize there's certain things you expect us to do. You expect us to figure out the bass, which is obviously, and figure out what's the next note, and then voice over. I get all that. But am I interpreting it wrong that there's not a certain amount of freedom of how you want to play it?
There is. I mean, anytime you have harmonic choice, you'll find that, something as simple as, well, I could play this in root position, or I could play it in first inversion. And in this case, well, that's part of what I wanted to go over, because there are some things that might make you choose the same thing as someone else who's approaching it with the same viewpoint that I have. So you're absolutely correct that anytime we're dealing with, even something like shell voicings, you've got two options. You can play it with the seventh or the third above.
Exactly.
And the things that you want to keep in mind are certainly the range, because you don't want it to get, like, if it starts to get in a very low register on the piano, it gets too muddy. And you don't want it to get too high. So really what I wanted to talk about this week was some of the reasons you might make a choice when you're doing this. And
all right.
There's quite a few factors, and you're right that either choice might not be right or wrong. One just might work a little better, or just give you a slightly different result. So, and to jump in, we might as well just jump into it. So if you're choosing between the root and the seven and the root and the third, these shell voicings, they're incomplete, but they often work pretty well because they do give you the sense of the chordal motion, with the root being on the bottom, and a lot of times the melody will complete the harmony. And if you notice, I might reference 10-1 first. As we're looking at 10-1, the range, we have root and seven above. And if you notice what the melody note is, it's an E flat, which is the third. And then when you resolve that to the F, I have the root and the third. That E flat, even though it only lasts for one beat until it starts to move, is now the seventh of the chord. And as you continue, you'll notice that the B flat, the melody note, is the third. And then the left-hand choice is root and seven. And then this whole thing is going to continue. So I have now root and third, and then the D is the seventh. When I go to A minor 7, I have root 7, but the melody note is the third. And now the melody note is the 7th on the D7, and I have root and 3. And then I'm to the G major 7, where the melody note is the third. And now it does hit the third again. So the choices are not just for the basic, okay, well, I can do this or this. and it sounds nice if I alternate. The choices are also made because the relationship to the melody creates a little bit more complete sense of what the harmony is, given that, okay, well, the melody is the third, or the longer note is the third, so let's see if I can play the seventh underneath. And you'll find a lot of pieces of music do that, and it's something where, as you learn more and more theory, you start to see, well, quite often the melodies of pieces tend to target those strong notes of the harmony. So the number of times you'll see the third in the melody will be a lot. There's some tunes that are written completely with almost every single note is just the third of the melody.
Yeah.
So because of that, the choices that we show here in 10-1, while they're not the only possible choices, they actually work very well because in relationship to the melody and the range that we're trying to play in, they come together in a very functional way that would be, a smart choice for anybody who is doing it, I think.
Okay, I get your point. All right.
So you're going to find similar things when you do New York State of Mind. And again, I'm pretty flexible, so the idea is just the concept of root 7 or root 3, and if you get that part of it right, then you've done the assignment correctly. But if you take it that next step, notice, we start you with root 7, and then the third is the melody. Now this C is also the seventh of the D7, and for the most part, it sounds nice if we alternate between root 7, root 3, root 7. That's not always going to be the case, but it works, and then that's the 7. And if I play root 7 on the G major 7, then I have the third here in the melody. So I would suggest starting there. The one thing that doesn't always work, if I continue to alternate from root 7 to root 3, then the G minor 7, that doesn't fall suit, because the G minor 7, I think, works better if I play root 7, because the melody is so sometimes within the context of the progression, if you start with root 3, it works well to go like root 3, root 7, and then root 3. And if you start root 7, then it maybe makes sense to go from root 7 to root 3, root 7. But, again, it's not the only way to do it. The other thing you have to be careful with is not to get too low. So if you keep moving down, it may work better like in the last line if I reposition and play root 7, and then root 3, and then root 7, again because of the melody notes. So the factors are overall range, not to get too low or too high, and seeing where the relationship lies with the melody, and if that relationship can be kind of enhanced, based on the choice you make, whether it sounds a little richer. So if the melody is the third, then if I play the seventh and the bass, I actually have a more complete picture of the harmony, given that I have the 3, the 7, and the root based on those factors. So hopefully that makes sense.
Well, the only reason I brought it up is that on the exercises there seems to be, I don't remember which one, or there was a number of them in different keys, and 3 chords which I assumed to resolve themselves, and I sort of had it was like, what's your definition of resolve?
Yeah, well,
do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I liked it, or did it resolve in my mind, at least when I was listening to it, or is there something I could have played differently that might have given it another turn, so to speak? That's the only reason I brought it up.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good point. It was something that I wanted to talk about. Resolution, that is, there's so many factors, and the more you study harmony and you start to study counterpoints and why something sounds resolved or not resolved, and what types of chords give you that sensation of feeling, resolved.
Right.
There's a lot of factors. It's certainly the voice leading and the voices, how they move and how they complement the melody is another factor. We're sort of limited this week in that you really only have two choices. You either have, the root's gonna be on the bottom and you have either the seventh or the third above. So
Right.
because of those limitations, you don't have nearly as much opportunity to experiment with all of the other factors that maybe, if you had a 3 or 4 note chord, you'd have, multiple positions to try, even like you did in the triads the other week. You had a few different choices in terms of which
You did have
inversion.
Right, you did have choices there to play with, didn't you?
Right, yeah, you had many more choices, yep.
Yeah.
So, you're gonna have more choices as the weeks go on. We're almost at the end, but you get more and more choices for the most part, next week. Harmony is a fascinating study. I mean, there's all of the factors of, how does it sound in relationship to the melody and to the harmonic content, and then how does each individual voice move, and do you have voices that sounds melodic as counterpoint to, with the primary melody too, so. It's a fun study. Trying to think if there was anything else. The only thing I was thinking of too is just to go over a couple things. Someone had asked a question in a post about, as you're working on some of these, because the Pavan, I think, was a challenging piece, the Ravel, the 9.2, and it's challenging in a few different ways. I think it's challenging because the sound of it is not maybe as straightforward. It's a little more exotic sounding with the harmony, and the placement of the melody is not always quite so, strict in places that we might think of where it starts, where the phrase starts on maybe the second beat or the upbeat of beat 3, like in measure 3 and measure 1. And also, there's no drums to kind of ground us really clearly to where the pulse is. So all of those factors, I think, were a little bit tricky. So the only thing that I just kind of wanted to remind everyone is, as you're working on pieces like this, I think it's helpful to get the hand in the position of the arpeggiated chord as a block. Maybe I'll just show that one more time, just to reinforce that. If I can get this to work. What do we got? Okay. All right. So, as you're thinking of these chords, rather than think of them note to note, think of how would you play it as a block of notes. Did I lose my video? All right. Somehow I lost it. Let's try again. There we go. So thinking of these as blocks, and how you would play. And if you can get used to feeling that shape of your hand like that, then adding the arpeggio is not so bad because your hand's always over the notes that you need it to be over. So that's a good, I think, kind of secondary way of approaching it. Let's see if I can get this a little better. Not great. iPads, they're good and they're bad. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in particular. Just walk through this. I think the harmonies are pretty straight ahead. Just be careful, well, it's probably good to go over, just be careful with the chordal qualities. I think sometimes people get confused, and there's a number of different ways of writing a chord. No one's ever settled on one thing, which is a little bit unfortunate. It's the source of great arguments at school. What's the best way to write? So I tend to write, if it's a major 7 chord, for example, I like seeing M-A-J, and I actually still use capital M-A-J. I think, okay, if I'm on a gig, it's dark, if I see that, I know it's a major 7. Now they've started to shift to where it's small letter M-A-J, but you still, sometimes will see a triangle as a major 7, which I hate, or just a capital M, which again, I think is an awful thing because it's so easy to confuse if someone's in a hurry and they're just sight reading something. So with minor chords, you'll see we use the dash. I don't mind M-I-N, because sometimes you'll see that, but I think I prefer the dash. And then dominant chords, you'll just see, you know, the root and the 7th. And the basic rule is if it doesn't say major 7, then it's a lowered 7. So if it's C major 7, you'd have a B natural, which is the 7th note of the C major scale. But if it says C7, you know to lower it a half step, so it's a dominant chord. So in this one, New York State of Mind, because you have to figure these out, just be careful. So if it's an A minor 7, the minor means it's a minor 3rd relative to the major scale, right? So it's C natural, and if it's the 7th, it's a lowered 7th. And these are always relative to the roots major scale. That's how I look at, you know, learning these chords. I know sometimes in theory courses I've seen that people teach how many half steps or whole steps, and I think that's too complex. I think if you just know what the major scale is, okay, the 7th is a half step lower if it's dominant, the 3rd is a half step lower if it's minor. And keep in mind there is a minor major 7 chord, but because of the rule, it would have to say, for example, C minor and then M-A-J 7, so it's C minor major 7. And if you've ever seen like a James Bond movie, you've heard minor major 7 of the that one, that's a minor 7 chord, so remembering what it sounds like. So B minor 7, it's a D natural as the minor 3rd, it's an A natural as the flat 7, right? Because it does not say major 7, so just remember all that. So we've got a G major 7, A major 7, so they're all relative to the major scales, which is another reason to learn all your major scales, at least, you know, 1 octave up and down, so you always have a reference point. And then as we start to do inversions, I'll get into that next week. I don't want to go too crazy. But just keeping in mind the chord qualities, and if you look at another lead sheet from another book, sometimes you'll see the labeling is a little bit different than what we have here, although this is a very, very common way as you look at New York State of Mind to label them. I mean, dominant 7s are pretty much, well, I say that, but if you have a real book or some of, you know, there's a lot of different companies that make, like Cher makes a real book and Hal Leonard has one, you'll sometimes notice, even with a D7 or a C7, a dominant chord, they'll label it as a C9, and that's terribly confusing to most people. That means a C7, and that 9 is a tension that can be added to the chord, but it's very unclear to someone who doesn't know a little more advanced levels of harmony. So if you see C9, C13, they're really C7 chords, and they're saying, well, but use tension 9 with this chord or use tension 13. But if you didn't know that, I've seen students play a C major 7 with 9, not knowing that it had to be a dominant chord. So if you see C9 or F9 or F13, it's really just an F dominant 7 chord, and then 13 is an optional. And we're actually going to do a few things with tensions in the last week, which open up lots of colors for the harmony as you go through and start to play them. Yeah.
Sir, I had a question, sorry. I know I've been out of school, or like this class in particular. It's been kind of hard, especially getting on the piano, but I'm catching up. I just had an interesting question about the chord. You said that it's an additional color, so for example, you have an F7 and an F9.
Mm-hmm.
You would play an F7 with a 9 inside of it? So that's what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, the harmony, 9, it's called 9 because in traditional harmony, we build chords in thirds. So it's, you skip a note. So as I walk up, I have 1, skip 2, 3, skip
right.
4, 5, and so on. So we really call it 9 because using that method, we get to it after we go past 7, 8, and then there's 9.
Right, 8 is your tonic again.
Right, 8
9.
is the tonic, and then 9, so it's the second note of the scale, just like 11 is the fourth note and 13 is the sixth note, and at that point, we've covered every note in the scale. So it doesn't necessarily denote where it's played, which I think is a confusing factor. I can play 9 under the third or under the seventh. It doesn't have to be above. But yeah, it adds another color. So if it said, F7 with 9, then you'd have a G within that F7 chord, right? So you'd have, as an example, if I'm going to play F7, here's root position. And if I played, say, first inversion, I think it was third inversion, and I have root, instead, I quite often, when we're doing it on piano, if we're playing a melody, a lot of times we play them what we call close position or closed position, meaning if we have the chord in one hand, when we start adding tensions, we usually start removing notes from the chord. So instead of root, I would play maybe the G instead of the F, and then if there was a bass player, you'd have your...
Right.
So it depends on the context. If I'm playing, solo piano, then I'm often playing chords using both hands. So I could play F7 as an example, like F, E flat, A, D, G, C, right? So that's the spread voicing, but my hands are looking at this in order to shape that. But if it's close position and you're playing a melody with a bass player, then a lot of times we're actually removing a note in order to add another note.
I see. All right. Thank you, Dave.
Sure. And then if you had 13 on a dominant, usually we'll change the fifth, right? Because the fifth is the closest to the 13, 5 to 6.
Right. It's an octave up.
Right. So they have 7 with
Interesting.
and dominant chords, there's two notes we tend not to use with the dominant chord because they kind of fight what they are, which would be major 7 and the 11, which is sus4, right? Because normally you want to hear that go to that, so we wouldn't use them together quite so often. And because of that, because they have